John, welcome. And the stage is yours for the next approximately 40 minutes.
Thank you, Marcel. I'm not sure that it's good to be introduced as an officer of the British Empire because there is no British Empire. Thank God. I've not been to Brno before, so it's a big pleasure for me to be here. And one of the things that is not a surprise for me is that I travel all around the world working with governments developing their creative industry strategies. And in almost every country, the second city of the country is thinking ahead of the first city of the country. And what I've already heard this morning, it's clear that in Brno and in South Moravia, you're thinking about these things in a way that it's difficult for a capital city and a national government to think. So I think, we have a saying in English, second city first. And it seems to me Brno is a good example of a second city first. Creativity and Innovation is the title that you've given me. And in preparing for this, I looked at your wonderful little diagram, which Mr. Vitula also talked about. But what interested me most was the first pillar and the fifth pillar, these two. Because in a sense, the skills and the innovative businesses that you talk about in the middle pillars, everybody knows these things are important. But innovative governance, the first pillar, and image, the fifth pillar, these are much more difficult concepts to get our heads around. And I'm not talking about the image that Brno has for inward investors. I'm talking about the image that the creative industries and creative economy has in the rest of the world. But let me start first by looking at these two words, creativity and innovation, because in English they're quite tricky words, and I'm sure they're also tricky words in Czech. Now, here is an example of innovation. This is called a Sinclair C5, and it was invented in the 1980s by a leading electronics engineer, Sinclair, he's a genius, who invented one of the first personal computers. And he set out to invent a new mode of private transport. New materials, new technology, new thinking. Everybody in the UK was very excited about it. And that's what it looked like. 5 were built, 3 are in museums, 2 of them are in the rubbish bin. Okay, so creativity is not necessarily an outcome of good results, and I think we sometimes forget that. This is the most successful road machine ever built, a Honda Super Cub. Almost 100 million of these have been built. It doesn't look very creative, it looks very boring, but every year for 50 years, Honda made it a little bit better each year. It's a classic example of innovation. It is almost impossible to improve this bike, and now they just go on making them, and people go on buying them. Every pizza in the world has been delivered on the back of a Honda Super Cub. So my point is that creativity is about disruption, and it's about change. Innovation is about evolutionary change, and I think we have to bear in mind always that while it's important to be creative and disruptive in our thinking, in our practice and in our policies, we really do have to be innovative rather than creative. And it's one of the reasons why governments have a lot of difficulty with creativity, because it is disruptive. The concept of creative industries may be very obvious to us, but it's not necessarily obvious to governments, and it's not necessarily very obvious to citizens. Mr. Vitula talked about the need for Brno to get more skilled people coming into this region from overseas. I think one of the big problems we have everywhere in the world is that most parents do not want their children to be working in the creative industries. If the kids say, I'd like to work in the music business or the games business or the film business or the design business, and mum and dad say, why don't you be an engineer or a doctor or a lawyer? There are some really big conceptual changes that we need to think about in the way not just our economies work, but the way in which our societies work as well. And if you ask any politician in the world, what is going to be the foundation of the economy? And you said you have a choice between a car factory or 101 small creative businesses, some of which will go bankrupt, any politician will say, I want the car factory. Okay, that's still an issue of cultural change that we've not accomplished. And in the UK, where on the government's own figures, the creative industries now employ more people and generate more value for the economy than the car industry, the aerospace industry, and life sciences industry combined, still politicians, while they talk about the creative industries, do not really understand, I think, or do not really appreciate the consequences of what they're talking about. And again, it is partly this business that creativity is disruptive. It feels like it's not substantial. Of course it makes politicians nervous. It would make any government nervous. Governments don't like disruption. Of course they don't. And it's good that they don't like disruption. But we have to think about how we combine the necessities for disruption with innovative change. And that's really what I want to talk about. The fifth pillar of your innovation strategy about image. I want to talk a little bit about the image that we project of creative industries around the world. 20 years ago, of course, the creative industries did not even exist. We had film, we had music, we had design, we had dance, we had jewelry, we had fashion. These things have been around for a long time, but the notion of the creative industries as a sector simply did not exist. And when we started doing work on this in the UK, we chose almost on an arbitrary basis 13 industries that were dependent on the generation of intellectual property and dependent on individual creativity. And we produced a mapping document. You've done some great mapping documents here in South Moravia. But the government was not really the government commissioned the study, but they were not very interested in the result. When they got interested was 2 years later, when we did another mapping document, and then we could show that these industries that we'd selected were generating jobs twice as fast as the rest of the economy. However arbitrary the definition, you could not argue with the fact that this sector was growing faster than any other part of the economy. That's when the finance department began to get interested. And it's one of the reasons why, with mapping, the real secret of good creative industry mapping is having consistent data sets over time so that you can properly understand trends and properly understand growth. It's something that we easily forget. But of course, that's not the only problem with defining the creative industries. Most of them, as we know, have almost nothing in common with each other. They're all different industries, subsectors, and also they're very different in scale. In the UK, our creative content businesses, the average size of a creative content business, the government reckons, is 3.5 employees. 5 years ago, it was 3.9 employees. So in one sense, the individual businesses within the sector are getting smaller. It's a micro sector, not even an SME sector. But on the other hand, it also includes big transnational media companies that are rights holders and rights distributors. So what are the things that tie this sector together? Of course, it's difficult in policy terms to be thinking about what it is as a coherent sector and how it might work together. And of course, we also know that the creative industries are full of tasks and jobs that are not very creative, and non-creative industries have plenty of jobs that are creative. Our organization, Nesta, in the UK, reckoned that a few years ago, that there are almost as many creative jobs outside what we define as the creative industries as inside the creative industries. So what do we mean? What is this story that we're trying to tell about creative economy? And as if that was not enough, I think we also know, all of us in this room, understand that when we talk about the creative industries, we're not simply talking about the economy. We're talking about a much wider spread of issues. This is a definition produced in the United Nations report of 2008 by a Brazilian economist. And you can see, I won't bother to read it, but she's saying you can't analyze this sector simply in terms of traditional economic understanding. It crosses the personal, the social, the cultural, the emotional. It is a much, much more difficult sector to be thinking about than pharmaceuticals or aerospace or any other traditional sector of the economy. And here, another definition, which was produced last year by a man who's one of our leading cultural commentators in the UK. And he makes the point that maybe the secret about the creative industries is almost not what they do, but the way in which they are organized. And that's also one of the things that I want to touch on in the next few minutes. So, for all these reasons, I think we underestimate the need to be thinking about the story of the creative industries. What do we mean by the creative industries? Because if we are going to have effective policies, and we're going to convince governments and citizens of their and business people of their importance, we have to be thinking about some of these first principle issues. I think that there are 4 reasons why we're right to argue that the creative industries are hugely important. And the first is, as technology changes and communication improves, the value of manufacturing in the global economy is actually declining. In the 11th five-year plan in China, one of the slogans that the Chinese government used was, "We must move from made in China to designed in China." And there are a number of reasons for that. One of them was, of course, that wage inflation in China now means that it is cheaper to make your goods in Vietnam or Indonesia than it was in China, so they have a real problem of labor market pricing. But the other issue, which is crucially important, is that they realize that the value of the goods that's being created lies in the intellectual property that that product contains. So, for example, the iPhone, many of them manufactured in Shenzhen in southern China, many of them manufactured by Foxconn, a company you're familiar with here in the Czech Republic. Apple reckoned that the proportion of value of an iPhone that goes to the manufacturer is about 6%. The proportion of the value of the iPhone that goes to Apple is 60%, because they invented the concept. They own the intellectual property. And it's worth pointing out that the iPhone was not designed by an engineer as such, it was designed by an arts graduate from the Royal College of Art in London. And although this is a quote about the Mac rather than the iPhone from Steve Jobs, it illustrates the fact that it is design, intellectual property, the concept of these things, which is now of much more value in the world's economy than manufacturing. So manufacturing itself is in decline as something of relative value. And if you think 50 years ago, nearly all the biggest companies in the world were manufacturing products. But now the biggest companies in the world, Apple, Microsoft, Facebook, Huawei, Weibo, Alibaba in China, these companies, some of them are manufacturing products, but they are nearly all in the economy of experience, of communication, of software, of social structure, of media. It's not a manufacturing economy, it's an intellectual property economy, not just in Europe and North America, but right around the world. So that's one of the reasons why I think we have to be much more serious about this issue than we have been in the past. And this is not something that's just restricted to our part of the world. The United Nations reckon that the fastest growth in the creative sector at the moment is in Africa and Latin America. They're starting from a much lower base than we are, but they're accelerating and catching up with us very, very quickly. And the value of the UN definition of creative industries is $2,200 billion US dollars a year. It is a huge and growing part of the global economy, not just the European economy. So the second reason I think we're right to be ambitious for the creative industries is that they're universal. They don't depend on extracting minerals from the ground. They don't depend on the massive capital investment which typified industrial production in the 20th century. They depend on human talent. And what we know is that talented human beings are absolutely everywhere. And we also know that the growth of digital technology means that we're getting to a point where almost any citizen in the world, however poor they are, have access to some kind of smartphone technology. And that means that they are able to participate in this economy of creativity in a way that's not been possible before. And it's in many of the poorest countries of the world where the smartest ideas are coming because they're driven by necessity. That means that this is a sector which is not only growing in importance, it's becoming globally competitive in a way that, the steel industry or the pharmaceuticals industry is never going to be. This is something which depends primarily on individual creative talent. And there are 9 billion people in the world, and a lot of them are just as creative as any of us in this room, and we have to remember that. So here's another reason why I think we need to get serious about this. It's often said that oil was the fuel that drove the world's economy in the 20th century. Nobody could argue with that. But equally, it's also said that creativity is the fuel that will drive the world's economy in the 21st century. Now, you could say that's just a romantic slogan. But the point about it, two significant points about it. One is the more oil we use, the less we have. We know that. The more oil we use, the more damage we do to the planet. We know that, and we're doing it. The great thing about creativity and creative thinking is that the more you use creativity, the more you have. It's the opposite of oil. It's a resource that grows rather than depletes with use, which is why, as an economic strategy, it makes good sense for any government to think about it. But also, it's the creative thinking which is going to give us the tools to undo the damage that oil has done over the last 100 years. So, thinking again, longer term, about the future that we all want to have for our children and our grandchildren, the issue of the creative industries as a key changer in moving out of the paradigm that we're currently locked in internationally is absolutely crucial. And then the final point is this. Here's a car factory, but there are no human beings. Okay? It's robots. Robot was a term that was invented here by the Čapek brothers here in Czechia, so it's something that you're familiar with. But it's estimated that something like 45% of jobs in the US, current jobs in the US, are at risk of automation in the next 20 years. A big survey by Oxford University in the UK reckoned 35% of our current jobs are at risk. That's 15 million people. Now, of course, we know that one of the previous industrial revolutions demonstrate that changes bring all kinds of new jobs, but we have to think pretty seriously about the consequence of this because it's already happening. And it's not happening in a way that hits everybody equally. Here's the Bank of America commissioned a study from Merrill Lynch, and one of the things that they said, no surprises here at all, one major risk is the potential for increasing labor market polarization, especially for low-paying jobs. Already low-paying jobs are at risk. We know that. That's happening already. And the chief economist at the Bank of England, talking about the UK statistics on the same thing, said the space for human skills could shrink further. Okay, and that's pretty serious too. But the most alarming quote I've come across is from that Bank of America study where they said, and I quote, "We are in danger of creating a large number of people who are not needed." A large number of people who are not needed. What are the social consequences of that? It's a crazy remark because many of us are not needed. If you think about it, most of the prominent personalities with which we're familiar in music, in sport, in the media, you could argue in politics, in academia, they're not strictly speaking needed. Already we're in an economy where most of the jobs that we do are not strictly needed. And the important thing is that those are the jobs which are least at risk from automation. All the evidence points to the fact that the more creative a job is, the more it depends on emotional and social intelligence of human beings, the less likely it is to be replaced by a machine. That's very obvious, but it does mean if we're going to think about having socially equitable societies and economies, what are the kind of jobs that people are going to do? How are we going to persuade parents that it makes sense for their children to think about jobs in this new economy? And this isn't just about high-skilled jobs either. I work with a university in India which has built a network of 100,000 craft artisans making very, very traditional goods. Many of them are illiterate, but because they use smartphones as the communication method around the cooperative, all the communication is by voice and image, so the fact that these workers are illiterate is not of consequence. They're highly skilled people. And because they're working as a cooperative, they're able to negotiate enormous multi-million-dollar contracts with international firms for fabrics and jewelry and leather and so on. The point about it is they have skills that cannot be replaced by machines. And I recently read a piece by a leading economist in the UK who said, anything where you can measure the productivity is basically something that could be done better by a robot than a human being. So we better focus on all the things that you cannot measure in terms of productivity. And she said, what are those things? She said, wasting time, having fun, being experimental, thinking new ideas. Okay, that's not a job for the entire world, of course, but it's an interesting point that it's an economist who says we need to be thinking about these skills which we do not measure in the conventional measures of economic progress and success. So these four big reasons for taking the creative industries seriously. The changing value of manufacturing. Manufacturing is still important, but it's being done less and less by human beings, more and more by machines, as that picture illustrates. The fact that the creative industries, however we define them, constitute one of the fastest growing sectors in the world economy. That's another reason for taking it seriously. The fact that they're universally available to people, that they are on the whole not as damaging to the economy as the economy that to the environment as the economy that we've had is important. And changes in the global market which are promoting artificial intelligence and robots. These four changes add up to absolutely fundamental change for all of us. And I think we underestimate that significance. More than half the world's population is living in cities, and that proportion will only increase with consequent expectations for a higher quality of life, but growing pressures on our being able to maintain that quality of life. Unemployment is a huge and growing problem already. In Egypt and in many countries of the Middle East, more than 30% of university graduates are unemployed. You think of the consequences of that. We're depleting natural resources at an unsustainable rate, polluting the planet at an unsustainable rate. We see some of the consequences of all these factors in migration, and I don't need to tell you, with the election that you've just had, a referendum, an election that we've just had, that issues like globalization, mass migration, the threat of job insecurity, these are things which are not going to go away. They are issues that we need to address. And we need to be thinking about the role that all of us working in the creative sector have in resolving some of those issues. So I think we need to move on from talking about the creative industries to talking about the creative economy. And in the same way that you could say in the 19th and 20th centuries, the factory system dictated much of what went on in our societies. The big factories shaped cities, they shaped the education system, they shaped the social lives of many workers, even though they were not the main employers of labor. They were the dominant force within the economy. And if you argue that perhaps what is emerging is a new paradigm in which the creative economy and the driving forces of the creative economy are the basis for our thinking about a wider creative economy, then what does that begin to look like? So some of these ideas will be familiar with you. The sector that we're talking about is typified by small businesses, agile businesses, where collaboration with competitors is as important as competition with competitors. This is quite unlike the industrial society of the 20th century. It's an economy of iterative development processes where failure is not seen as a catastrophe, it's seen as work in progress. And you may know, some of you may know this, but Cisco, the big American company, has as one of its staff slogans, it's better to ask forgiveness than seek permission. Okay? It's better for you to take a risk in your business and get something wrong than to wait until the boss tells you it's okay to do it. Now that is, if you think about how that relates to what goes on in our schools, you see how widely separate our education system, the values of our education system is from what's going on in the economy. Better to ask forgiveness than seek permission. This is an economy where it's iterative, where failure and experiment are part of the process of creating new products. It's an economy which is driven by specialist or niche products and services, unlike the old 20th century economy, which was primarily about mass production, mass markets, and efficiencies of scale. It's a business in which investment in people and skills, not capital and equipment, is crucial. And already, right across the European Union and in North America, investment in intangibles, soft human skills and so on, is already far greater than investment in tangibles, meaning factories and machines and so on. This is a trend which is already happening right across the whole economy, and it's a trend in which the creative sector is by far in the lead. And it's also an economy in which the social infrastructure is as important as the physical infrastructure. And what do I mean by that? We really can't separate social and cultural life of societies from the economic life, where clusters of industrial businesses depended on access to coal and water and transport. The creative economy depends on access to new ideas, competing ideas, symbolized by the universities. I want to come back to that in a moment. By cultural diversity, by stimulating civic life. Mr. Vitula talked about the relationship between universities and the initial work done in the creative sector. Here, it's often said universities are the coal mines of the 21st century, in the way that certainly in the UK, our towns grew up around the coal mines. And our towns now are growing up around our universities. The two cities that are growing faster than any other in the UK at the moment are Oxford and Cambridge, because of the huge spin-off that comes from the universities and the relationship between these two sectors. I want to talk about that in a minute. But that's the kind of raw product that we're looking at. We can't separate these social and cultural facts from the way in which the economy is progressing. And London is a classic example of this. I mean, London is undoubtedly one of the world's leading creative centres at the moment. But 30 years ago, London was in decline. The population was dropping fast, manufacturing was leaving fast, the quality of the city was going down, people were moving out, the government was pushing people out of the city as much as they could. And what's turned that around is arts and culture. A massive public arts program that made people think differently about their city, huge investment in museums, theatres, and in education, but also in public space, in the quality of buildings, in pubs, in clubs, in bars. These things are what has turned London around. And now the problem we have now is not that the city is shrinking, but it's growing. The director of the public transport for London, the transport infrastructure, his big problem is that London's expected to grow by 2 million people in the next 15 years. He doesn't know how the hell he's going to provide a transport system for them. What's turning that around is culture. It's the cultural life of the city that's changing the economy of the city. You can't disentangle these two things. And I think that's something which, again, we acknowledge in a way, but we don't really see it as seriously fundamental as it is. So one of the things that's quite surprised me, and I think it grows out of this process that we've been through in the UK, is a few months ago, our government, which is not a particularly imaginative government, I have to say, they published a new industrial strategy proposal. And one of the things that absolutely amazed me was, one of the pillars of their industrial strategy, they said, was we need new institutions that combine sector and place. Okay? That really surprised me. In other words, they are recognizing that an industrial strategy in the 21st century is not something that can be rolled out on a national basis. It has to be rooted in the specifics of individual cities and places. That is a very, very fundamental shift for a government to take. And of course, it's one of the core attributes of the creative sector. These industries grow out of the culture of a place. They grow out of the heritage, the skills, the expectations. Okay, I've been told I've got 10 minutes, so I'm going to speed up. So government is not necessarily well placed to do this. We do need to have new institutions, and new institutions that can combine sector and place, which may be ad hoc, which may be informal, but they're certainly needed. And of course, one of the other reasons why our government included that was because of the Brexit vote, that large numbers of people in the country felt so completely alienated, they felt the economy had nothing to do with them, they felt they were getting no benefit from it, and they're not people who are going to move by virtue of the fact that they are the ones who are disadvantaged by economic change. They're not in a position to move, they can't afford to move. So we have to be thinking about how we build an economy that includes those people in a more creative and imaginative way. So again, economic thinking and location, place, the cultural and social identity of a city, you can't disentangle. So now I do want to go on just to talk briefly about what we do at Creative England. Because although we try to be very radical in our thinking, we also try to be innovative, in other words, evolutionary in the way we work. And in a sector that's so dominated by small and micro businesses, we think it's essential to have intermediary organizations that can provide specialist and local support and act as a bridge between public policy and small businesses, and encourage businesses to talk to each other in a different way. Officials in any department find it difficult and irritating to deal with the creative sector because it's made up of a myriad of small businesses. They prefer to be dealing with sectors where there are a few big employers, the car industry, life sciences, aerospace. And it's difficult for them to engage with a sector which is so fragmented and diverse. And I think having intermediary organizations, as you've got here with your with the organizations that are delivering your regional strategy, these things are very important and are going to become more important. So our slogan, if you like, at Creative England is talent is everywhere, but opportunity is not. We only work outside London. We work in partnership with local authorities, local enterprise partnerships, and most of all with universities. And we focus on content, on film, television, video games, because that's what we were initially asked to do by the government. But increasingly, we're also investing in technology, because it doesn't make sense to be thinking about creative content without thinking about technology. So one of our second slogans is art and technology in harmony. The Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK did a study in a southern city called Brighton of 400 digital media businesses to see what their work practices were. And what they discovered was the businesses where the employees with an arts and humanities background treated the employees with a science and technology background with mutual esteem, with a parity of esteem, they were the ones that were growing faster, 3 times faster than companies where either the technologists were in the lead or the creative artists were in the lead. It's a classic statement of the fact that these two things have to go together. As we open up new creative possibilities, we need the technology that can deliver them, and as technology opens new doors, we need the creative applications that will exploit that. So that's another of our mantras. And another most important one, in a sense, is from subsidy to investment. When we began, we were awarded quite a lot of money from the government to distribute as grants and subsidies to firms. And we said, we're not going to do that. We will make it as equity investments or as loans. And the reason for that is because many small creative businesses, their creativity is terrific, it's very good, but their business sense is not so good. And if you give a small company a grant or a subsidy, it gives them a false illusion of security very easily. And by giving them a loan, they know right away that they have to have the financial discipline to be able to repay that loan in 3 years or 5 years or whatever it is. So they have to think about financial planning and business planning. And we also offer them mentoring to help them do that business planning. And as a result of that, if they get into trouble, we don't necessarily take them to court. We can extend the loan, we can change the repayment periods. But as a result of that, we're now getting 95% recoupment on our loans. So we've got a permanent fund of money that we can carry on investing. And the point is here, I think a lot of our initiatives in the past in the UK have seen the creative industries as a cultural sector that needs to be supported. And of course, in a way, it's true. But our argument is it's an economic sector and it needs to be growing the economy. And we have to think about it as businesses and commercial businesses. And we have to be thinking about investment rather than subsidies. Another aspect of our work is there's been some conversation this morning about startups. We were also expected to invest a lot of money in startups. I've worked in the film industry, and I know we have many schemes for first-time filmmakers. And there are lots of first-time filmmakers, but what interests me is who are the second-time and third-time filmmakers, because they're the people who you know have got real determination and quality. And increasingly, what we're trying to do with our initiatives as an intermediary organization is to identify companies that have real long-term potential and work with them and build clusters of businesses around them, rather than spreading the money around saying, let's just have creativity. It's got to be much more focused and much more disciplined than that. And then another aspect of that is what we call big guy, little guy partnerships. We've spent a lot of time, and it's not easy, brokering partnerships between micro businesses and big companies like Sony, Microsoft, Disney, and even our own health service in the UK. And the benefits are mutual, because the small company brings new ideas, innovative ideas, new people to the big company. It re-energizes the big companies. But what the small business gets from the big corporation is to think much more systematically about how they generate intellectual property, how they protect intellectual property, and how they're going to grow their business, how they're going to access new markets. So it really works as a process of absolute mutual benefit. And I know this is something that's beginning to happen here. I think to encourage big and small businesses to work together is one of the one of the innovative ways of thinking about how we move from an old economy to a new economy. And then another aspect, a very obvious aspect, celebrating creative champions. We run lots of competitions, the 50 most creative businesses in the country, the 10 most creative entrepreneurs in the country. It's not necessarily very serious competitions, but it's a way of encouraging more people to think about this sector as something that's producing new ideas and interesting ideas. And it attracts a great deal of interest from the media. Of course it does. Another aspect of what we do is what we call stories that other people ignore. We have a small division making films and television, but we try and focus on parts of the country and stories that other people are not thinking about. So we've just made 2 films set on small farms in England, and the small farming sector is collapsing. They're not films about farming, they're films about farmers and issues about farmers. Both of them have been commercially very successful. And our view is if we're telling authentic stories about the way the world really is, not only are we contributing to the cultural life of the country and getting talent that otherwise would not be heard on screen, but we're also creating good businesses. People pay to go and see these films because they're worth going to see. So I think that all these initiatives, if you like, are small ways of interacting with and persuading government and other big businesses to rethink the way they work and the way they think. And at a time when public finances are under pressure, not just in our country, but all over Europe, one of the other areas that we work in increasingly is to think about how we can contribute to the provision of goods and services by government. So one of our mantras is not what can government do for the creative industries, but what can the creative industries do for government? Now, I mentioned at Creative England, we have a joint investment fund with our National Health Service. This started off with video games companies developing services for elderly people with dementia to help them manage their own healthcare by turning it into games. But now we're becoming involved in all kinds of aspects of what's going on in the health service. Non-clinical solutions to problems which doctors thought were clinical, if you like. And we can make a real difference. Another company we invested in, a games and TV business, they came up with a virtual reality system for the courts in Liverpool so that the presentation of evidence to juries could be much clearer than it had been before. The police love it because they say most of their police officers are not very good at presenting evidence. This helps them to present evidence with real clarity. The court service love it because it's reduced costs and it's improved the quality of trials. Here's a games business which is helping to sort out the scheduling problems and the cost problems of our court service. And it goes on way beyond that. I mean, I was talking to an engineer for Rolls-Royce developing the next generation of engines for airplanes. He told me that he's using software and coders from the games industry because they can contribute to his visualization of airflow through engines. And he's saying very often people out of the games industry are very competent mathematicians, but they have a very different mindset from conventionally trained engineers. Okay? A company that's involved in motion capture for the film industry is using the technology of motion capture to work with hospital services where young people with cerebral palsy are unable to walk or are having difficulty walking, and by using the technology of motion capture can help them to exercise in ways that make them use their bodies much more effectively and less energy intensively than they were before. Another example, somebody we worked with whose daughter was severely disabled, had a prosthetic limb. He thought the prosthetic limb was ugly. He's in the 3D printing business. He made an artificial leg, which is also a work of art. Okay? And he now has a very, very successful business creating prosthetic limbs which are also beautiful. Why shouldn't they be? It's something which nobody had thought about in the health service before. And another example from the health service, the Design Council in the UK began to work with hospitals on how they could reduce infection in hospitals, not by clinical practice, but by redesigning equipment. and designing equipment which it was easier to clean, making it of materials that were easier to clean, and so on. So designers came up with a solution which had previously been seen as being a clinical solution. And I think these areas, and one more, a biochemist in Oxford who leads the biochemistry department in the university told me that one of the big problems that he has got is data visualization. And the way he has solved that is by building partnerships with people from the entertainment industry and again the games industry to help his researchers produce effective data visualization. So in all these ways, particularly in health and education, but in other areas of business too, the skills and talents of the creative industry can contribute to government rather than drawing on the resources of government. And that requires a culture shift. But it's something which is already beginning to be underway. And then finally, I think as part of that, we need to change the way in which governments buy goods and services. One of the other aspects in our recent industrial strategy in the UK was the government's commitment to sourcing 30% of all public procurement locally from small and medium enterprises over the next 20 years. At the moment, most government contracts go to big international firms, even though we know that many of those firms are cheating the taxpayer and are completely fraudulent and are coming up with generic solutions which do not meet the needs of very, very particular localities. By devolving the purchase of government services, it means that local government and regional government can source products and services in a way that really does respond to the needs of that local community. And in some areas of England, that's already having an impact. One of the problems, if you're thinking of exploring that idea, is that EU procurement legislation makes it very difficult to procure locally rather than go simply on the basis of price. But we introduced in the UK a Social Value Act, which means that if the local government or the regional government can demonstrate that there is social value in awarding the contract locally, then it should override any benefit of price that a big company can offer. So I'm sorry, I've been talking too long. But I just wanted to come back to some conclusions, having set some of these ideas out. I think that we don't think ambitiously enough about the creative industries. I think we need to be thinking in a much bigger context about the creative economy. It's still a new phenomenon. It's something that's posing challenges. I don't think any of us have got answers. I think what you're doing here in South Moravia is as interesting as anything that's going on anywhere, but actually it's by exchanging ideas that all of us improve and grow our practice. And I just wanted to finish up with this United Nations report from 2013. They do a regular study of the global creative economy. And they looked at hundreds and hundreds of case studies from all around the world. And the three elements that came out most strongly, which they record in the report, is, number one, there is no such thing as the creative economy. Every city, every region, every country has different issues and different solutions. It has to be bespoke. It has to be tailor-made. Secondly, you cannot disentangle cultural activity from economic activity anymore, anywhere in the world. And the third thing is that the successful initiatives are not initiatives that start on the basis of need, but they're initiatives that start on the basis of an area's assets and capabilities, its strengths. And the assets and capabilities that all the communities that they look at have are the people. It's human talent, human creativity, human assets that will drive this forward. And I think one of the lessons that we're wrestling with in the UK, and I'm sure you are here, is back to these words, creativity and innovation. We have to be much more risky and creative in our thinking, but we have to be innovative and systematic in the way that we implement ideas in practice. And that's the way in which we can move from the tail end of an industrial economy in which creative industries are beginning to be more important to a creative economy where these industries that we're talking about today, the way they work, the relationships that they have, the relationship that they have with government, can become one of the dominant forces in our society. So thank you. I hope there's a little time for questions. Thank you.